All right, we are ready to go. So we have a manageable agenda this evening, four kind of areas that I'm going to cover. I will need to know from you if you are unable to hear and see me, please indicate by doing this or something to let me know that you're not really hearing or seeing me um, reliably. And please make sure that you have your cameras on. I do want to mention to you that we're not sure how the BACB is going to handle attendance in classes over COVID. They may ask for an excerpt or a copy of the recordings. And part of my concern is that we just don't know what they're going to use as a litmus test. And it could very well say, well, if we can't see the person, then they're not there. So I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of that. All right, so let's get the show on the road. Let's talk a little bit about grading. All of the items that have been submitted to me in my section for grading, activity 1, research summary, educational theory. I've put some comments in your submissions and I have submitted them back to you. So everyone that submitted those should have gotten a grade from me or feedback. If you're in Dr. Shaman's section, I'm not sure where he is with that. We kind of oscillate at different points in the semester. With that said, the type of feedback that I typically give are one of 3 different times. Sometimes I email you a list of things, and that sometimes includes a rubric. Other times I embed some of my comments in your actual writing. And then thirdly would be in the comments section in Moodle, I will sometimes just list some things that I want you to attend to. And that's pretty much the 3 different ways that I typically try to provide some feedback. If you would like some additional interactions and you want to meet via Zoom, that is perfectly fine. Just schedule sometime, usually in about 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes a half an hour. We can cover a whole lot of information if you and your situation is the only thing that we're talking about. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. If you have any questions about that, let me know. I do want to give you some advice here. We are now in week 4. We have just started week 4. So I would definitely make sure that if you haven't turned in what was due for week 2, that you try to get that done very systematically. So don't try to bounce around. Just get week 1 done. When you're finished, move to week 2, and you should have ample opportunities to catch up with some things. All right. Any questions before I move on to the IRB activity? I think this week I probably had a larger onslaught of really good emails asking really good questions than in recent memory. I don't know if that's more of a function of my recent memory or reality, but I was very impressed with some of the questions that I was getting through email. And I still probably have about 20% of those emails left to answer. Sometimes Dr. Shanman will chime in and answer some of them, but just keep in mind that I am planning on answering them. And if you didn't hear back from me, by midweek, just send me another email to prompt me. I think that some of your questions require more than just a yes or no answer. And I want to make sure that I'm giving you the time that it's going to take to answer your questions appropriately. All right. Okay, so if there are no questions, I think we are going to try to move to the IRB activity. We're going to switch our screen to the IRB document. And let's see if I can find that. And the chat window just popped up. So I'm going to take a look at that before we switch. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Find it. All right. Vincent, am I completely on full robot right now? Okay. All right. Okay, again, please let me know if it's just not working out. Okay, let's talk about the IRB process. First of all, everybody will be completing one of these babies. Secondly, and I think it's due in like 2.5 more weeks. All right, so the rest of this week is week 4, and then the week after that, the end of the week after that. So I guess 2 more weeks. The IRB is an acronym for Institutional Review Board. Every entity should have an equivalent of an institutional review board. If you have humans in your organization that people will be doing any type of research on. For the most part, almost everything we do in behavior analysis is about engaging in some research. When we put in a tactic for a client, we don't have any guarantees about whether that tactic's going to work. So we have to put it in with fidelity and take the right measurement and then arrange the environment accordingly so we can isolate the variables that are contributing to the change. So it is kind of, I guess, a bigger deal for most behavior analysts because our jobs require us to do research. And so there's different layers of kind of IRB approval. And the IRB approval you're going to get done for this class is really akin to what needs to be done when a university is associated with your work. And all of you are in that position right now. So it's really important to understand that process. Sorry, let me turn this off. So I'm going to take you through this step by step. And here's what I want you to keep in mind. Make sure you're paying attention right now. For the most part, I'd like for you to think about the IRB for your project this semester very globally, very broadly when we're going to write up this IRB. Try not to get overly specific to start off with, because that's going to pigeonhole you in this spot where you're not going to have a lot of room to develop. Now, remember, we're not implementing what you design. However, if you're taking a class with us next semester, you probably don't want to waste your time and set up the whole project and never do it. So what I like about this class is we can take our time setting everything up, going through all the appropriate channels, really having some thoughtful commentary on the variables that go into good research projects. And then if you are in a course next semester, I know some of you are taking this course at the end, but most people are taking this at the beginning. You already have a really nice, well-developed and designed research project ready to go. So I think that that is a way to harness the best out of what you can get out of this class, as well as one of the great things you can get out of the program. So please keep in mind that when you're writing this, write it as broadly as possible. And I'm going to go over some of those things with you this evening, line by line. All right? So let's start with number 1. Imagine that. So every project has to have a title. These are just exemplars that I'm sharing with you right here. They're not meant to be quintessential or definitive in any way. There's some pretty good things in here. There's some pretty bad things in here. And I took out any identifiables which you want to actually make sure that you can at least keep as many things as possible anonymous, right? So the title of your project, almost all of you are going to be engaged in some projects where we're looking at the basic principles of behavior, right? And we're trying to increase or decrease something. It's pretty much the way it goes. So you might want to think about a title at this stage of the game. That would be the effects of implementing tactics derived from the principles of behavior on increasing age-appropriate skills and decreasing behavioral excesses. I just made that up off the top of my head, but I was trying to think of something that would uniformly apply to everyone right now. So I would highly consider a title that incorporates those types of pieces. You very well may be like, I'm doing it on peer tutoring and it's going to be with adolescents who have self-interest behavior. And you could certainly write a title for that project that would be the effects of peer tutoring on self-interest behavior of an adolescent. Okay. However, if one little thing goes wrong while you're researching, while you are designing it, you have to write another IRB. You don't want to do that, right? Maybe you can list some specifics in an example underneath your title. Doesn't really matter. And think about, you have to be in a place where the title I just shared, or my rendition of the title, would apply to everyone. If you're not doing something on one of the behavior analytic principles or a derived tactic to start off with, then we're probably definitely doing the wrong thing. And if you're not doing something to increase an appropriate learning target or decrease some type of behavioral excess, we're probably doing the wrong thing. So that is why I suggested that. Okay. Any questions about where I'm trying to get you with the title? All right, let's move to principal investigator. That would be you. And who else might it include? And there's other places you can maybe put this, but you can certainly put professors, you can put supervisors at work, and in some cases you could put maybe your mentor if you're in one of the classes that are mentor assigned. That's perfectly appropriate, and there might be some other reasons why other people are involved, but those are typically the list of usual suspects. That's it. All right. Let's go on to number 3, collaborators in outside institutions. All right, if you are working at a private facility, then maybe a collaborator of an outside institution could be the university. If you're working at a private institution, maybe a collaborator could be another institution that's kind of providing some support. Families Helping Families group. It doesn't matter. Not all of you will likely have outside institutions, but I do think there are 2 boxes you should tick. One is where you're working. The other one is the university. Those are logical places to start. You could always add something to it, but for the purpose of this assignment, keep it relevant and keep it as simple as possible. You can certainly list on there that your professor for this class has approved the study. And when it's time to complete this, we'll give you guys an example of a letter so you can legitimately attach the letter. All right, so I think the first 3 things in this document are pretty straightforward. Now is kind of where a little bit there's a little bit more attention to detail, and the devil, of course, is in the details. So number 4 is about a general statement of the problem and the formation or the formulation of a research hypothesis. So what is it? What issue are you investigating? And what type of hypothesis have you formulated? That is why I wanted you to think about those things in your educational theory. That is what you're supposed to be thinking about, is what is your theory as to why a client does X instead of Y? A client does A all the time instead of B all the time. A client has been exposed to numerous learning opportunities, but their graph is flat. You say, so what is the problem? How would you define that problem? And then what is your hypothesis as to solve that problem? So many people just want to jump to the magic bullet. Oh yeah, we do double correction procedures at our site, and that's what all kids need. And so I want to do a study on that. That's not how it works. Yeah, we do incidental learning at our site, so I want to do a study to show that. That's not how you do research. You start with the issue or the problem that you're trying to solve, and then you go to the literature to see how has that problem been solved. That will either establish or eliminate a starting point. Then you use that information to determine, what do you think scientifically is happening, and how are those pieces connected? So in essence, you are identifying a problem statement. Why is it even important for people to be concerned about this? And how do you think it manifested itself? Why is it a problem? How did it come to be this problem? Why can't we solve it with just a change of the schedule of reinforcement or something along those lines? Again, think broadly here. When individuals are also diagnosed with numerous types of disorders or disabling conditions, a host of issues may be correlated to that. Of those issues, some of them may affect social interaction, learning new things, possibly self-injuries or repetitive behavior. I mean, just think about things. Therefore, it is possible that their learning history has not allowed them to contact typical ways of dealing with these. Therefore, for this intervention, we will use some of the most evidence-based procedures in behavior analysis. You could get a little bit more specific than that, but still try to think on broader terms. All right, and certainly you could read here, and you could extract some information from there that I think's also broad. And basically the bottom line is that in this situation, the researcher wanted to use a structured environment. All right, so that can mean a lot of different things, but start off with the broadest explanation possible. I think you need at least one well-developed paragraph here, maybe two, but one for sure. All right, let's go to number 5. Here's where you might have to start being a little bit more specific. Okay, and again, don't cross that line to where it is a point-by-point blueprint of something. No, you may want to draw from the style that you did your tactic reviews, where you had to list step 1, you do this, step 2, you do this, and so on. If you've done a tactic review in another class, but you are sequencing some things, you are determining in here what are the different phases that the individual or individuals might go through. How are you going to arrange those phases? In phase one, which would be baseline, here's what I'm doing. How are you collecting the data? So it's just a helicopter view of a picture of something that might get implemented. All right, so this is a little bit more technical and a little less broad than some of the other pieces we talked about. Again, you're not writing a 5-page summary of this. It is still within likely 1 to 2 paragraphs. So inevitably, people get confused between 4 and 5. I'm going to go back and emphasize the differences. In 4, you are talking about a problem and a hypothesis. In 5, you're talking about the plan for actually laying out the research. What's going to happen first, what's going to happen next, and so on. They should be connected in some way, of course, but those are the differences between 4 and 5. All right, the rest of the items are actually really very straightforward. So number 6 has to do with the number of participants, characteristics, source of the participants. How will you get the participants? Will the data be, how will the data be used? What are you going to do to protect the anonymity of the participants? And so on. All right, so I'm going to give you some really specific advice here. I think everybody should write up to 10 participants. Doesn't mean you're going to have 10, but you're going to write up to 10. You can write a little bit about some of the relevant characteristics, level of verbal behavior, cusp or capabilities present, where are the participants coming from, how will you get them? You are going to notify the parents that you might be studying these variables and you would like to know if their child would be interested in participating. Something along those lines. You're going to keep the data in a locked cabinet. You're going to make sure that the participants' names are not on it, and you assign the participants a number, and you keep the list of what participant goes with what number. So I think everybody should talk about 10, and everybody should talk about the relevant characteristics of the kids that you see every day. That's likely who will really be part of your project's design. All right, now, once you've decided how you're going to recruit them, how will you actually select the ones that you're recruiting for the study? So you can recruit 20 people, but you might only select 10. How are you going to determine who out of the 20 you're going to take? Again, you might want to have something that's purposeful. So all of the children that were recruited, I will take the first 10 that represent male learners with language deficits that are greater than 2 years. 5 male and 5 female learners with at least a score of X, Y, or Z on a criterion reference assessment. Just determine of the pool of recruitment, how are you determining who gets selected? They want to know, generally speaking, are your participants going to be paid for something, paid for their time? What type of trade are you offering? Generally speaking, you could talk about that participation would be part of that participants reinforcement system, and they would be given points or tokens for participating, following directions, those types of things. You're not going to put in here, if you have a contingency, this is not necessarily where you're going to put it in place. I think this person did do that, and that's not the same thing. Having a contingency for performance in the study is part of your tactic. That's part of your intervention. That's not what you're giving to people just for playing along, so to speak. All right, number 8. First of all, who would be considered a research assistant? Well, anybody that might be collecting data at your site. So if you have a few people in your study, the likelihood of you being the technician for every last one of those people is probably nil. And I remember when we did this at the, when I was teaching at the Chicago school, we were working with a school and we were using the paraprofessionals of the school as research assistants. And we had to write, how would we be training these people? And we couldn't find a time to train them, so we actually couldn't use them. And we had to end up going and finding additional graduate students who were in a different class to come into the school to do that work. All right, but basically it's who might be helping with things like data collection. All right, number 9, source of funding for the project. When you do any type of research that will be grant funded, you're writing, like right now, there's some grants available through ABAI. There's always grants available through the federal government, state higher ed boards, and so on. If there is a source of funding that you are trying to obtain with your project, you would want to list that here. In your case, for the purposes of this class, there is no source of funding. So you would simply have not applicable, or this does not apply to this research project. You always want to do that to make sure that if there's any conflicts of interest, there's some level of transparency there. So let's say, for example, you're testing, the effects of PECs. And you wrote a grant to Andy Bondi, the purveyor of PECs, and you got it funded, and he's going to pay for the research. Now, you have to disclose that, because it's a situation where the purveyor would stand to gain something by you doing research that could point to his product as being effective, and which could change the bottom line for him. It doesn't mean that all bets are off if that's the case, but you have to be transparent about it. All right, so we're a little over halfway done with this document. Do we have any questions on items 1 through 9?
I had a question about number 5. I just want to make sure I understood it fully.
Yeah. It's like the method section of your paper.
Okay, so like basically, I know you said like maybe 2 paragraphs, but I'm thinking like, are we making it to where if somebody read it, they could basically replicate it, or not that specific?
Your paper's going to do that, Heidi.
Okay.
All right. This is just going to give people a snapshot.
Okay.
Okay. Now, it is very common that when you write an IRB, people come back and ask for more clarity. Sometimes if you write it in too much detail, the IRB reviewers don't read it, and they'll just scratch it out and say, too much information here. I can't go through all of this. I want to know the bottom line. Okay. So there's a sweet spot in there, but it is not meant to be a blueprint that you would go back and implement with fidelity. They have to get the gist of what you're doing.
Okay, thank you.
That's a good question, Heidi. All right. All right, number 10, expected start and ending dates for the project. All right, here's what I would do. I would start it now, and I would put the end date a year from now. I realize you're going to be done with this class, but every year there are people who get some traction going with this, and it ends up working out, and they end up implementing it. And then we realize they wrote the IRB only for one semester. And so here they sit with publishable research that they now have to go back to the IRB committee and ask for forgiveness, because you're not supposed to collect data outside of the window of time. And a lot of times they don't grant it, so you have to throw it all away. Again, that's not a requirement for this course, but I'm kind of thinking ahead, and I would put it for a year. If you do end up getting engaged in this project, again, not because you're required to, but because it just happens, either in this class or another class, and you see you're running out of time, we could always ask for an extension. Okay. All right. What would be the potential benefits of this project? Why do you want the participants in it to start off with? So they could learn new skills, close the educational gap, remove the barriers of their condition, develop new cusping capabilities so they can learn differently. Those would be some of the benefits almost to everyone. And so that's what you want to get across. Here's the bottom line. People need to see that what could potentially happen for the individual participants is worth something. This is going to take 3 months for them to do, but look what they're going to get out of it. Look what's going to be different for their lives after. Number 12 is extremely important. And no matter how many times I say this, I don't know what it is, but it's not always getting through to the coconut here. Just like in number 11, you have to talk about the potential benefits. In number 12, you have to talk about the potential risk. Note to self, there are risks involved with every piece of research. The main risk is if your procedure doesn't work, then the individual has lost instructional time. That is the risk that applies to everyone. And what you have to show is that if that happened, you would be providing the participant or participants with extra time. You're going to extend the day, open services to weekends if they want to, but you have to acknowledge that that might happen and come up with a solution. I remember when I did my first IRB, it was on how we were going to take children who did not like each other, who would get into fights quite frequently, who sometimes were in different gangs, okay? And we were going to put them in a peer tutoring paradigm, because what the research says is when kids tutor each other, they benefit socially and academically and all of this. So we put that since peer tutoring was one of the most evidence-based procedures, there were no risk. And I remember the lead reviewer in the IRB came to me and said, "Are you trying to tell me you're going to put potentially violent children together and you're going to have them teach each other, and there's not one chance that one of them might beat the crap out of the other one?" And I was like, oh, well, if you put it that way, I guess there are some risks. So we had to talk about the fact that we would have counselors on staff. If someone did get hit accidentally, if there were any bullying episodes going on, we would have the school nurse involved. We had pillows and protective gear, all of this stuff. We made sure that the experimenter was always sitting between the two, things like that you're illustrating. What are you going to do to minimize the risk? So again, think generally, and the idea I gave you about losing valuable therapeutic or instructional time is definitely one that you have to consider. Now, if you're doing something with a punishment procedure, and let's say that's definitive, then you probably need to include that in there. And how are you going to safeguard that? And so on. All right. This is specifically related to how you're going to guard the anonymity of the participants and confidentiality of their responses. So it's a play off of a question that was previously asked. And you just want to be very specific about that. If you're going to put it in a locked filing cabinet, who will have the lock? What are you going to do with the data after the study's gone? Are you going to keep it for a certain amount of time? Then are you going to destroy it after? And so on. So a little bit about HIPAA and FERPA, I think probably comes into play here. All right. As part of any good research.
7-year.
Oh, yes. What's that?
I'm sorry. I was wondering if the 7-year duration of time to keep records applies here.
You can. Some people can only keep the data for a year, and some people, their policies at work say 10 years. So it generally is, you put the amount of time you will reasonably keep it, and you see if the IRB committee approves it. If they approve it, then that's what you can go with.
Okay.
So it's reasonable and customary. That's the two things you want to think about. All right. So what IRB committee members want to know is, how are you making this project translate to something that is understandable for the participants or for their families? How transparent are you in the process? You always need to make sure that there's no coercion. You're not forcing somebody to be in the project. They can back out at any time. What is going to make up their participation? Do they have to spend time in a small room, smaller than normal? Do they have to spend time in a noisy room, noisier than normal? What about the experiment might be very different from what's going on with their normal lives? And how will it be conveyed to them about their participation? We want you to be part of this project because we think it's important that you learn how to work with other children, and you learn how to self-manage, and you're going to be doing that against the backdrop of just keeping a checklist, or I don't know, I'm just making this stuff up, but you need to let people know that their participation will be kept confidential. And if they're filling out something, if they are completing a questionnaire, if the family's involved, any correct or incorrect responses for something, you have to ensure that it is kept as confidential as possible. It can't be completely, you cannot provide complete anonymity, because you're going to know who it is, but you have to talk about that, and that you're keeping it as confidential as possible. Technically, you are going to draft a letter of informed consent that you would be sending home with each participant. You're not going to necessarily do that, of course, unless you would be really running the experiment. But the committee needs to see, how would you draft this letter? And it's consent for the participant or assent for the family. Now, generally speaking, I think all of the kids need assent forms. You're always going to ask the family, as many of them who can possibly answer, you want to get consent from also. There may be some situations, depending on what you're working on, that it might not be possible to get a valid consent from the participant. In those cases, you would need to definitely have the assent form in place and signed off. Again, you're not going to get it signed off because you're not doing it, but you have to develop one. And there should be an example for a research permission form at the top of this course's Moodle shell, like in the general resources. It's not necessarily a consent or assent form, but we generally just put generic research permission forms. You could beef it up. There are tons of examples online, like 2 million hits. I don't think it's going to be problematic for you to find any of those. All right. If you are gaining participants from a specific institution, a company, another organization, and they are responsible for the participants, you need to have some document in place granting you permission to do that. So if you are at Milestones in Lake Charles, you would then need Melissa to give you permission to be able to go ahead and engage in this research. And the university would want to see that. Again, I know I've said this many times, you are not doing the research, but you're doing all the parts, except the implementation. All right. What types of ethical procedures are in place at the site of the data collection? So Melissa approved the study at Milestones, but what did she engage in to determine that? It can even be something where you'd say Milestones LLC has its own ethical review process. They are bound by the ethical code of State Behavior Analysis Association and the National Behavior Analysis Certification Board, and they followed those procedures in order to provide us permission. All right, 17 definitely applies. You are working with a special population, and it's twofold. You are working with minors and individuals with some type of condition, disorder, disability. Both of those are considered protected classes of individuals. You have to actually articulate that you are aware of that. You have to identify that and indicate how you handle that in terms of assent and consent. It's possible that some of the individuals were able to provide consent, and you would write that here. The minor with this diagnosis provided consent, and we obtained assent from the parents. Of the 10 individuals in the study, these 4 did not provide consent because of X, Y, and Z, and these 6 did. All right, that part you're going to write hypothetically, okay? You won't have that information readily available, so you're going to write it hypothetically. All right, number 18, will the participant be exposed to any psychological intervention such as deception, contrived social situations, manipulations of participants' attitude? We have to include all of this stuff in there. Contrived social situations, maybe so. It is possible you could write something like, because one of the variables we are looking at is language development, it is possible we will contrive some social situations in order to induce language development. If you're, hopefully not, but if you are using a punishment procedure, that needs to be in there. If you're working with adults, it's possible that you might not be able to tell them what it is that you're doing. And so there's a little bit of deception involved in that, and you have to minimize that as much as possible. So those are the components of an IRB. Number one, make sure that you moderate your responses. You can write forever on this. Don't. This one right here, this is an actual example from a thesis that was written by a student, and it's 5 pages long, okay? You're not writing a thesis in this class, all right? So definitely do not go longer than 5 pages. If it's 1 page, somebody might laugh at us and not, so probably needs to be longer than 1 page. Again, I'm not a big stickler for length, but this is something that if it's too long, it's a problem. And if it's too short, it's a problem. So somewhere between 1 and 5 pages, probably a good fit. And a lot of this stuff, you have research summaries, you have other work that you've done before that you can pull some of those generic things in there. I would say a vast percentage of what you need to put here, you've already done in some way, shape, or form somewhere. Be creative about how you're going to piece that all together, okay? All right, so generally speaking here, people don't have problems with this assignment unless they don't do it, or they try to hand in something at the last minute. We take these and we bring them to the IRB committee, and they give us the feedback, and that's how you get your feedback. Some semesters it is very detailed. Some semesters it's not. Some semesters certain people get detailed responses, and it's kind of random. All right, so it's part of the game, and we just play it to make sure that number one, you are very aware that this is an important part of the research process, and number two, we have to do it because it meets the requirements of this course, and it's part of the ethical process that involves this type of research. Okay. Any questions about IRB?
I have one.
Yep.
Do you ever show the IRB application to participants or the parents of the participants?
A couple of things. First of all, you need to give the families kind of like a short summary of the IRB. Okay, so it could be an abridged version, because you want to make sure that you're writing it for an academic committee, basically. Not all your families are going to have the wherewithal to read that. So you want an abridged version of the IRB, and you want that to be in the consent and assent forms. Okay. Now, when you in the assent and consent forms, you would say the details of the study are being sent to an independent institutional review board for permission. When that approval is granted, you will be notified. And so, some people do a separate little checklist for, did we notify the participant? Yes, initial here, and so on. Those are all things you can consider, but it's one of those things, Ashley, that once you kind of get the process in gear, it becomes like second nature. I will say this. So for most of the entities that I work with directly or indirectly, I've recommended that when they take parents on board, they are telling parents that this organization engages in quite a bit of research, and here's what you need to know about research in general. And by signing this, you're assigning that you're going to be part of research projects. No, So that last part is not applicable to everything. You just can't like agree to sign your life away for any research. What we try to specify is that on a daily basis, in regards to your child's programming, which you have signed off on in terms of an authorization plan, there are some inevitable research pieces that are there, right? However, if it's anything outside of that treatment plan, then that blanket consent when you come in does not apply. Because the treatment plan signature isn't okay. You have to collect data, you have to determine if it's effective, and you are supposed to change things if it's not effective. That is what, right? But if you're doing something outside of the treatment plan, or it's more elaborate than that, you will need an additional consent and assent form, okay? All right, and I know I said this a bunch of times, but I really want to make sure people don't get confused. You're doing all of this as kind of like the dressing, but you're not actually engaging. Families won't get these forms. You're not implementing the procedures, not for a grade in this class. There are always individuals that end up doing the project. And sometimes it's at the very end of the class, sometimes it's in another class. That is not a requirement for this class. All right. Okay, we're a little bit ahead of time. Let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back right at about 6 o'clock, and we're going to shift to dimensions of behavior and data collection. So I'm going to pull that up on the screen right now. And we'll try to get that done in 20 minutes and save the last 10 minutes for questions, which it's always a challenge for me to get this done in that amount of time. Okay. And we're back. All right. Just make sure people are back. Okay, we're getting started, so flip those cameras on. All right, don't worry about what it says here, Module 3. This is from a much larger training, and this is typically the third module. So look at it this way. I've already tested you out of modules 1 and 2, and we're going straight to module 3. So that's the good news. We are going to talk about data collection, and I am very aware that all of you collect a lot of data. However, I'm not 100% knowledgeable about whether you understand when to collect what type of data for. And that is what we're supposed to be covering in tonight's class. So just keep that in mind. I have no idea why it's showing up that way. All right. Anything that is related to measurement will always have a unit of analysis and a unit of measurement. I want you to think about how those pieces fit together. And this is applicable across any type of science, okay? And the science of behavior is no exception. Generally speaking, when we think about measuring units of things, we might think about how long something is, how long something lasts, how much does it weigh. That's part of it. But when we talk about behavior, we actually have to open the door to different types of dimensions. So we may look at the unit of analysis, we're measuring crying. Well, what unit of measurement are we determining? We may measure how long someone cried, so duration. Our unit of analysis, so the variable of interest might be how often is somebody turning in homework? And then we might actually look at 3 out of 5 days a week. So it would be the number of correct and incorrect. So event recording here. We might want to know how far someone can throw a ball. And we might measure that across distance. So that is kind of like using a physical dimension, but we incorporate that into a behavior that we're trying to shape. We're trying to shape how far we're throwing a ball, and the individual is throwing it 1 foot, and we want to get to 5 feet. This would be the appropriate dimension for that. So sometimes there's some overlap with physical dimensions as well as dimensions of the actual behavior itself. All right, so everybody thinks this is like one of the easy pieces, right? Well, of course we want to measure things because we want information. But why? That information has to have a function. What are you going to do with the information? You want to use it so you can describe something that is uniform across the board. You want to make sure that Catherine and Christina and Kristen all can write about the same measurement, and it is understandable across, and it's the same across everyone. You want to be able to then compare that for the individuals that you're measuring. He did this first, and then he did this, and I could compare it. And then lastly, you want to be able to predict where things might go if you don't intervene, and where would you expect things to go if you would intervene. So description, comparison, and prediction are the functions of why we measure things, not just to have information. You've got to do something with the information. All right, so here's kind of an overview of some different types of measurement. And what drives the type of measurement that you select is, what are the dimensions of the behavior of interest? I want you to write this down, and I want you to say it 5 times in the mirror every night until you really get what you're saying. In behavior analysis, behavior is the variable of interest. We do not look at behavior as a representation of something else. And the only way to measure it is through direct and authentic measures. That's really important to understand that. In behavior analysis, we don't look at behavior as a symbol for something else we need to investigate. It is the variable for investigation. That is very different from what the social sciences do. In the social sciences, people are probably articulating it this way. He may have thrown down his books 5 times, but that is because he's frustrated and he's upset about the fact that he can't read. So we have to reduce the frustration. And if we reduce the frustration, we're going to reduce the number of times he throws his books down. Right? That is the opposite of the science of behavior. Frustration is not a cause or function of behavior. All right. And what does it mean to be frustrated? When Isaac's frustrated, he may put his head down. When Ashley's frustrated, she may go for a walk. When Jenny's frustrated, she might cuss up a storm. All right. So that's all based on self-reports, right? There's no frustration gauge, frustration monitor. Oh, zap you on the head with this a gauge, and it's going to tell you to what degree you're frustrated. Those are types of constructs. But in behavior analysis, we're concerned about the behavior at hand and what is maintaining that over time. So the only way to measure it is through a measure of the actual behavior, not a rating scale of frustration or anything else, or anxiety. Those things might be real, but they're not what's maintaining the behavior. Maybe they're correlated. Now, if I'm going to try to put some type of science on anxiety, I may measure shortness of breath, how deep my breathing is. I may measure maybe sweaty palms. I can measure my heart rate. And then if I say that those are elevated, I can then put a label on that and say that those things are happening, and I'm going to call that anxiety. Okay? But again, and trust me, I think those things are interesting and important, but it's still a leap that you are taking to infer that. And the more leaps you take to infer, the further away you're getting from the behavior at hand. Now, another piece that I want to share with you is that behavior beneath the skin, all those things I'm talking about, internal things, are susceptible to the same principles of behavior as behavior outside of the skin. We can apply the principles and the tactics to both types of behavior. And what's really important is that we just need a way to measure them. And we need a direct and authentic way to measure them. Okay, not anything that we're inferring. Unfortunately, with modern technology, you can put on a watch and measure a lot of these types of internal behaviors. All right. But remember, they are not representations of any one particular thing, right? And you really have to look at the variables in the behavior equation to answer some of those questions. So let me kind of spend a little bit of time talking about one of them that happened to me recently. So I was driving to get my second vaccination recently. And, I'm thinking about, okay, will I not feel well after? I'm thinking about all those things. And, I may have reported that I'm a little anxious about getting it. Maybe that's what I'm reporting. That's a self-report. That is a behavior. Self-reporting is a behavior, but it doesn't mean that what I am reporting is actually occurring, right? Those are two different behaviors that are maintained by two different sets of consequences. However, in the process of getting to the Albertsons that I was going to get the shot, a cop was behind me and his lights were on. And my hands started to get sweaty and my heart started racing. Okay. And I think I would have probably reported to someone that I was anxious at that time. So I think that I would have had two reports of being anxious, and one maybe resulted in some measurable differences and one maybe didn't. Okay, that's beside the point. However, I want you to think about why my heart was racing and my palms were sweating when I saw the flashing lights behind me. It has to do with those consequences. It has to do with the instructional history of when a police is behind you and they have their lights on, right? If that instructional history was different, and and what ended up happening is the police car passed me up in the next lane and went after someone else. And at that point, guess what happened? My actual sweaty palms and heart rate subsided because the SD for that was not present anymore. And it's highly possible that I have seen other people get pulled over. I have read about it, and it has happened to me. So I have definitely been in direct contact and indirect contact of those contingencies. If it would happen to me every day and I would never get a ticket, then those consequences would probably reduce my heart rate and my sweaty palms. What I call it, anger, frustration, anxiety, intimidation, or whatever it is, may stay the same or it may change. But I can actually have a measure on those things that may or may not be associated with those labels. All right, so let's go back to the task at hand here and let's look at all of these different types of measurements. Oh, sorry. Oh, it's not going to work. Oh, I think there was one more.
Dr. Grant,
I'm listening.
can you say what the three functions of measurement were again, please?
Description.
Just the
Description.
what they were.
Comparison. And
Oh.
Heidi, can you hear me?
Now I can. It was breaking up.
All right. Description, comparison, and prediction.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So let's start taking these apart. Permanent product is anything that will result in a tangible product that stands after the behavior has occurred. All right, anything that's written, is permanent product. Now you can have audio and visual permanent product. With a cell phone, you can almost turn anything into a permanent product. So you can actually have a different type of measurement and turn it into a permanent product. And from that point, you can add whatever measurement feature you'd like in order to extract the salient features of the behavior. All right. A lot of times it's an outcome of academics. So that's great. But a painting can be a permanent product. So artwork, a sculpture can be a permanent product. If you videotape someone dancing, that could be a permanent product. And you could then take it and filter it through another layer of measurement in order to get information. But permanent product data is one way that we can measure things. From that point, we have to then determine what's the best fit for the right dimension of what we've now turned into a permanent product. What's great about it is that you don't have to be present, and you usually get higher IOA or ISA, inter-scorer agreement, if you have a permanent product. All right, now within that, or if you don't have permanent product, you can collect data via event recording. It is simply the number of times that something happens. It needs to be something discrete. It has to have a definite beginning and a definite end. It should not occur at high rates. If I'm measuring hand flapping, you are not going to use event recording to measure that. All right. A lot of learn units occur as event recording, but some learn units occur across every type of measurement. So don't make those two the same. All right, so you count event recordings by a frequency count. And you want to make sure that it's not something that you cannot find a discrete beginning or a discrete end, because you won't know what constitutes an event. Duration is when you're concerned about how long does the behavior last. It might be that the behavior, it might be something you're trying to increase and it doesn't last long enough. Child reading, child writing, maybe you need to stretch that out. And so the duration issue is that it's too short. However, if you're measuring something like a child falling to the ground and rolling or yelling, then you might be concerned about the duration that is too long. And you should be able to identify when it starts and when it stops. But in the case of duration, the behavior is contiguous. It goes on for a long period of time. And it's obvious that it started and it stopped. It's not an event that's occurring in a short amount of time. All right. So really important. A lot of what we do has to do with duration. Latency is when you're concerned about how long does it take for the individual to start something. All right, guys, let's take your pencil out and write your name at the top of the paper. All right, start. I gave the antecedent, and they started writing their name. Stop. That is the latency between your antecedent and when the behavior of interest started. A lot of times, kids get in a whole lot of trouble when there's too much latency. And sometimes kids get in trouble when there's not enough. So I'm sitting down, I have paper. All right, class, take your pencil and print your name. And by the time the person said that, I wrote it in script, or I typed it, or I wrote it in black ink instead of blue ink, or whatever. So when the latency is too short, meaning the antecedent wasn't provided, not even done yet, but the behavior started, it's almost like negative latency. But I want you to understand the concept. It's different from duration. Duration is how long it takes you to do the task, and latency is how long it takes you to get started with the task, depending on what the antecedent is. All right, any questions so far? I know that I'm at 6:21, but I think we're moving along nicely. And I want to know if you have any questions about any of the measures that were talked about up to this point. Check the chat. No. All right, now let's shift into interval recording. There are two different types of interval recording. Partial interval measures the presence or the absence of a behavior of interest at any time inside of an interval. We typically use this when we want to reduce behavior because it overestimates the amount of behavior. Whole interval, the behavior needs to be present throughout the entire interval. And we want to use that for behaviors we're trying to increase because it generally underestimates the behavior. So let's look at foul language versus appropriate language. If I'm coming at this from a foul language standpoint, I want to use partial interval recording. Because if my interval lasts 15 seconds, I want to know at any time in that interval, whether it's the first second of the interval, the 7th second, or the 15th second within a 15-second interval, was there any use of foul language? If there was, then you would put a plus for that interval because the behavior was emitted. So once the behavior taints the interval, the whole interval is scored as that behavior occurring. All right, now let's say we want to measure appropriate language. Then I want to make sure that in that 15 seconds, they've only said good things. And therefore, on that graph, I want to see an increase in those intervals. And I think that also revealed why it would overestimate or underestimate the behavior. Now, inevitably, the question is always, how do you determine the interval, right? And generally speaking, when you're taking interval recording, it is not done for convenience, okay? So if you have someone that is emitting a behavior where it's a discrete start and a discrete stop, and it's not lasting a long time, don't take interval recording with that. Take event recording, all right? But if you don't necessarily see a pattern, it could be in and out of the day, it's a little tricky in order to keep up with the data collection, meaning you might have data that are not accurate, then an interval recording system might be appropriate. With that said, you do want an initial count of how often it occurs. So you probably want some event recording data to start off with. So let's say that I'm with this child for an hour and the child emitted 6 occurrences of this behavior. On average, how often is that occurring? If they did 6 in an hour, on average, how often would you say the behavior is occurring?
Once every 10 minutes.
All righty. So then we might want to set an interval to start off with about every 10 minutes, maybe a little under, maybe a little over. You have to kind of figure that out. And then you start going from there. If you set it too high, so you don't want the hour to be that interval, what's going to happen is you'll have maybe 6 occurrences in that time, and the data won't be sensitive to what's really happening. Oh, sorry. All right, so with momentary time sampling, it's like an interval of time. However, there's a lot of drawbacks to this. First of all, we teach teachers to do this quite often because it takes less time and they're probably going to do it. So we at least have some data. But what happens is you figure out a duration of time, an interval of time, and at the end of that interval, you would actually look at the child and determine are they emitting the behavior or not. So let's say I'm trying to figure out, is the child writing during writing time? Okay, and I have to go around the classroom looking at all the other 30 kids. So I don't have time to keep my eye on that kid all the time. I'm not saying that's appropriate or right. I'm saying that that's a reality with some non-trained people. So momentary time sampling, the teacher may keep a motivator or some type of timer. The timer goes off. I'll look at the child. If they're writing, I would put a plus. Now, the whole time that you're walking around, they may have never been writing. But as long as they're writing when you look at them, you're recording a plus because you're taking a snapshot of that moment in time. One tactic to use with momentary time sampling is try to make the interval of time vary. Sometimes you look at them and it's 10 seconds. Sometimes you look at them and it's 5 minutes. Sometimes you look at them and it's a minute and a half. And you try to put the time on a variable schedule so the kid's not able to figure it out. All right. And you never want to really disclose that to the child because it could mess up the intervention and then the child's not going to get helped. But think partial, whole, or momentary. Always use event recording or duration recording or latency when you can and it's appropriate. But there are some instances where you might not be able to use that and you'll have to use an interval type of sampling. All of the pair test conditioning programs are on a whole interval type of time parameter. And that's because you want to see appropriate play for that entire time. And the total length of time when you add up all the intervals is important also. There would be really no other way to do that. So in that case, it's the preferred way of doing a pair test conditioning protocol. But in general, I find so many people resort to it just because it apparently is easier. And oh, we don't have to take as much data. It's never going to give you a clean picture. If you're looking at self-injurious or elopement or the use of appropriate verbal operants, count the number of times it happens as event recording. All right, so now we have these counts and we have to report them in terms of a behavioral dimension. So we used event recording. We would then maybe report it in terms of frequency or rate. And let's talk a little bit about frequency. It's just the number of times something occurs in a time period. I go to the store once a week is my frequency of going to the store. The number of opportunities should not vary. I can go to the store every day if I wanted to. So time and opportunity should be constant with frequency. However, if it's not, I can always move to rate, right? And generally speaking, we like to turn rate into a minute, but that's not always the case. So when the amount of observation changes, the amount of time that an observation occurs changes. One day I was in there for 20 minutes. The next day I was in there for 2 hours. The next day I was in there for 3 minutes. It's changed, and the number of opportunities to respond should be available. You should not take data when there is no opportunity to respond, or you should not take data on rate when you're controlling the opportunities to respond, right? So rate is always best when the behaviors could occur, but when the time is different. So you use rate to level the playing field. If you went in for 30 minutes and it happened 30 times, and you went in for 1 minute and it happened 1 time, the rate of occurrences are exactly the same, 1 per minute. And if you went in for an hour and it occurred 60 times, then you have 3 different pieces of data, 1, 30, and 60. And if you try to graph that, it's going to be very deceiving, right? It's going to be 1, 30, and 60. And it's going to look like it's shooting up in terms of occurrences, but it's not. The rate is the same because you would have 1 per minute across the board. Does that make sense? No? Yes? Maybe? Okay. Keep practicing that. Percentage you can look at when, and again, we're getting further and further away from a direct measurement with percentage. So I don't like percentage, okay? The percentage or the average of something is not about the occurrence of something. It has to be filtered through something else. So you're getting away from the actual behavior at that point. But percentage a lot of times is used with interval recording. The percentage of intervals with or without something, right? Now, when your intervals are fixed, you don't need percentage. You could simply report the number of intervals out of 20, the number of intervals out of 10. But when the number of intervals change, then you want to know what percentage of those intervals did the behavior occur or not occur. So when the number of opportunities to respond or when the number of interval windows are different, percentage is probably an okay way to level the playing field. All right. I get a little nervous when I see percentage used like as an average of something. So he averages 10% of the time turning in the homework. Well, what does that mean? He turns in the homework 1 time every 2 weeks. That gives me some information if I look at it that way. But if I have 1 time a day to turn in homework, but then I lose so much, like what day? Maybe it's always on a Monday. Maybe it's never on a Monday. You're not going to know that if you're not taking the data in a way that will be sensitive to that. And the other thing that bothers me about averages in general, this is why we don't like to report averages, is you might be talking about something that never happened. So if I'm playing basketball and I average 10 points a game, 12 points a game, 20 points a game, my average is going to be a number that I never actually made those points. Right? When I add those up and divide by 3, I'm not going to get 10, 12, or 20. Okay? Even if I do median, maybe, but if I do mode or average or any other measure of central tendency, I'm not going to get a number that actually occurred. If you're going to dive into a swimming pool and this part of the pool is 2 feet deep, the other part of the pool is 20 feet deep, and all you know is the average pool depth is 11 feet deep, you might end up paralyzed, right? Because you're using the average as information to make a decision. So in behavior analysis, we typically don't report averages, but we do report percentages off of a variable that is clean and discrete. All right, I'm not going to go into, we're over time now, and I'm not going to go into the other parts, but I am going to mention one thing about a few of these. Trials to criterion, similar to learning units to criterion. How many teaching interactions does it take for a person to master something? And of course, even though we want to deliver a lot of learn units every day, we don't want the trials to criterion to be that low or that large. We don't want more trials to criterion because it means the child probably didn't have the prerequisites to perform the task. And if the trials to criterion are too low, it means it probably came to the table with the task and repertoire, so we didn't teach them anything. All right. That is where we're going to stop for today. I think most of you that have looked at articles understand the concept of inter-observer agreement. You need the data we talked about to determine what the inter-observer agreement is going to even look like. Where you have inter-observer agreement with intervals, with events, with duration, and so on. So important part, but you have to know the other parts first. All right. This is a little cheat sheet that I like to use to help you determine what type of data do you need to collect. So you have behavior, could be any type, behavior you want to increase or decrease. If you're concerned about the amount of time, then you're going to go to the right side of this chart and then ask another question. Okay, I'm concerned about time. However, is my question about when they start the behavior? That's latency. Is my question about the duration of the behavior? The amount of time it takes for them to do the whole thing. If I'm concerned about the number of, then I'm going to not look at time. I am going to go to the left side of the flow chart. And if that is a discrete start and stop, I'm going to do event. If it's discrete or continuous, I may choose to do a type of interval recording or a time sampling. Hopefully this is helpful. This is in your Moodle course shell, so you can get it from there. And then this is another way to look at it. I think even though this looks simpler, more people like this one than this one. But it is a much more simplified version of how to look at the different ways to measure the behaviors of interest. All right, I'm gonna have to stop because I think we're going over, so I won't get necessarily to these questions, but I can get to your questions if you want to stay on board. I am going to stay with you until all of your questions are answered. So if you have questions, you can stick around. If you don't, you can hightail it out of here. I won't hold that against you. But if you do have questions, I'd like to be able to answer them.
I have a question about rate.
Yes.
So, Dr. Shaman mentioned a few times last semester, and we talked about rate in terms of intensity. And like, I understand it when he explains it, like conceptually, but like right now I'm trying to get some baseline data on a new behavior that I'm seeing with the client that I'm working with. And I really want to understand how to measure the intensity to determine if it's even socially significant to target behavior reduction because it's self-injurious behavior. But I want to make sure that it's like actually something we need to pursue if there's real injury coming out of it, if it's happening often enough.
I think you have a cross section of things. I think that the reason why those two are important is that you want a measure of intensity and you want a measure of rate. And then you want to determine if the child was doing it at a rate of 4 times a minute then go back to intensity and determine, was that a rate at 4 times a minute and 2 of those were at intensity level number 5, intensity level number 3, and so on. And then you might even, intensity and duration goes together also.
Mhm.
Okay. You might want to say in regards to rate that in the period of time right before lunch, the rate is 4 times a minute. However, it is 4 times a minute completely at a level 5 intensity. I'm just using those levels there. Intensity is going to require some subjectivity. You can make it somewhat objective, but I'll talk about that in a couple of seconds. But that's how you want to juxtapose it against each other. Now, the fervor of a response could impact intensity. So let's say I'm measuring stereotypy, okay?
Mhm.
And the individual's like this. And then the individual's like this. Okay, the intensity change and the rate of stereotypy also changed, right?
Right.
It's going to be really hard for you to determine the rate of stereotypy when the intensity gets high, because you're not going to be able to see the start and stop. That's why for stereotypy like that, duration might be good, and then layer intensity on top of that.
Right. How long did
And
the
that might be the equivalent of determining what the rate was.
okay.
You can't talk about it in the same vein, but you still would get to the same end.
Okay.
Okay. Magnitude and intensity are equivalent.
Okay.
What you might want to think about is you look at the behavior and, okay, let's say you're talking about physical property, destruction of physical property, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so if I do that, I've destroyed some property. But how intense was that? Right? Now, if I did this,
Right.
and then I did something else, I grabbed something else, and then I smashed a can, and then I threw this bottle down, or, then that might be a higher level of intensity. So I think what you would
Right.
look at, and let's face it, that's important, because if I'm putting in a tactic to reduce property destruction, and for 6 months, I was tearing up this room so much that you had to call a carpenter every day, and now my property destruction is this all day long, that tactic worked. You got somewhere. All right, we could work on tearing up envelopes
Right.
later on. But if I'm not having to call a carpenter to repair how you've destroyed the walls, we're getting somewhere. So that's one reason why magnitude or intensity is really important.
Right.
We didn't talk about that dimension tonight because
And I guess that was
it typically confuses people when they're learning the fundamentals. Okay, we usually kind of add that on after, but it's certainly an appropriate
okay.
night to ask that question.
I was curious for self-injurious behavior because I know like you and I've talked about this a little bit, but just like is it's self-injurious, but like is it at an intensity where it's socially significant to study it?
Yeah.
So that's
Well,
why I
I
was
think
kind of
again, it's
curious
an
about it.
overused term. I think self-injurious behavior is overused, and I think Mike Dorsey confirmed that when he was presenting on it at the last LAVA conference. And he really made me go back and kind of check myself, because I think if you see somebody do that, you're like, oh, it's self-injurious. No, the question is, was there an injury? Right? So you need something
Right.
to be able to show that. If you have a biter, was the skin broken? If you have a bite, was there an indention? Right? Is there a mark? then you would determine if it's self-injurious or not.
Right.
You have a hair puller, how much hair has come out? How many spots do you see of bald scalp?
Right.
Those types of things. So you need, in order to count something as self-injurious, you need a thing to determine if there was actually injury. You can't just define it by the physical property, like child took hand and made contact with head, because that might not be injury. You're measuring how many times the child made the contact with the head. That's a thing, maybe that, but don't call it self-injurious. So it gets tricky, right? If you have a headbanger on a brick wall, what are you going to look for? The lump, the splitting of the head? There are some things that you could infer, but again, it gets a little dangerous with that. So if a chunk of cement came off your wall, maybe you could infer that that was injurious. If there's a hole in your wall, maybe you can infer that that was injurious. However, guess what? We don't know whether it really was or not. When people are engaging in that type of physical interaction, they actually develop a higher threshold for injury.
Right.
Okay, now, I mean, your head gets shaken enough, I guess you do end up with a concussion, but that's an injury. So I think it's better to call those things what they are. And then later on, you could find out that they're injurious, and then you could put those two together.
Right.
Because it's tricky sometimes. It is.
Right.
I used to have this kid that would sit on ink pens, okay, and puncture their leg, okay, but we couldn't see any of that, right? I mean, we couldn't even see that it was something that was occurring. Mm-hmm. But the child was emitting injurious behavior every day. And we didn't know it took us a while to figure it out. Like even the parent couldn't figure it out. I think the doctor ended up figuring it out because we never saw the child. The child was an independent toileter. There was no reason for us to see the back of their thigh ever. And it was an older kid. The parent wasn't bathing the child. So there's a lot of trickiness that is involved in that.
Right. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. All right, what other good questions might we have?
I have actually a couple questions for you, Grant.
Yes.
So I was thinking for the article that I did a research summary on. So it was the project I was considering, but it was for new hire training. Like it was using behavioral skills training. Would that be a bad way to go for this class?
No, it's
especially
not.
If I wanted to possibly use it in a future class.
No, it's not a bad way to go. I think that there's probably not enough information on that out there. So I think that would be good. I think, Ashley, that what I think about in terms of BST, and this could certainly be just a me thing and not, a real thing. But I think about that BST to me is pretty straightforward, right? Like, it's systematic and everything. And I almost think like, why wouldn't people do BST? So I always think about this. To me, I think it's probably going to always show some evidence. But my point is usually, what are we going to have to add to it?
Well, and that's where I was looking at, what was the name of the other one that was basically an addition of also presenting non-examples of the behavior. That and I could look at it right quick and see what the name of it was. But so what I was thinking, what would have been great, but I just didn't know if it would be way too complicated for me for the time being for the project, was a comparison of the BST and what is it? Teaching interaction procedure.
Mhm. So I'm going to give you this little piece of food and you can take what you want with it. So there's three things we know about training people that are pretty evident. When we teach them the vocabulary of the science, when we teach them verbally mediated, we know that we also have to incorporate contingency shaped. So the way I look at it is the BST is the contingency shaped things, the things you want people to do, right?
Mhm.
But here's the part that doesn't always get brought in there. You want to bring in those other two pieces. You want to make sure you have something in that BST that's going to focus on the accurate use of the vocabulary. And
And
then
I
you're going to bring something in there to get them to think.
and,
And
and
it-
I think also having it laid out where it makes it efficient for supervisors that are training them, because I think that's one of the big problems is such a big load and trying
Absolutely.
to actually
That's right. That's right.
efficiently
But in that laying
train.
out of everything, in the laying out, I think what you want to incorporate is an element that's specific to verbal behavior of the science and an element that's specific to thinking. And what I mean by that is in the BST, you could have them do X, Y, and Z, and you're going to check it off your list, right? But I always like to ask, all right, what would you have done differently if this would have happened? Okay, or what?
Yes, and that's where the teaching interaction procedure, it did a
Yeah.
lot more
Yeah,
explaining the
Yeah.
reasoning behind stuff
Yeah.
so that they can actually understand
uh-huh.
why you do something. Like
Yeah.
that's why so many people language for learning, I'm constantly see them say, touch your head, click. I'm like, okay, you don't understand what core responding is or the reason for the signal.
That's right. That's right.
And it's even the supervisors will do it wrong. They're training. It's like everything from the top
Totally
down is
get it.
done wrong.
That makes complete.
And so they were never explained what so much as the reason for a signal is.
Yeah.
And so that's done incorrectly all the time because they don't understand the reasoning behind it. So it looked like
They're
the
just
teaching
going through
gap
the
interaction
motions.
procedure does that.
Boy, that's
And
a
I could
really
only
good
find
example. Ashley.
Yeah, and I think that I only found like 3 articles on the teaching interaction procedure. And that's where it just seemed like it would be so difficult trying to organize a way to compare BST and the teaching interaction procedure because it adds 2 elements, but are they vital enough to make it worth the extra little bit of time? I think so.
I think if you're careful about when you do them, maybe you don't have to do them all the time, but maybe in the scope of the length of time that BST would last for, you want to, maybe that's what you're looking for is the parametric, like, you measure, you keep constant all of the BST sessions, and then you look at, if I include 3 of the verbally mediated interactions, or 5 or 7 or 1, and look at it from a parametric, like a dosage point of view. That's kind of a big thing right now.
Okay.
And I am going to try to send you something that I think, a few things that we've published that talks about these things generically, and then the BST kind of fits real nicely within that.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that that wasn't kind of a bad way to go for this. Because the research that I found, it seemed interesting. It was like one of the things that was lacking was also even just doing it with new hires with no teaching experience. So many of the people had 3 years, and it's like, well, who knows what else they learned in that time.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, it seemed like there was so many ways to go when it came to training. So that's kind of where I was going down a rabbit hole this weekend, looking at everything out there. And okay, I've got to hone in.
I'll take another look at the BST article again. And are you going to be around on Friday, Ashley?
I am.
Okay, because
Yes, I was out
actually-
today because Corbin was out sick, but
Oh, not COVID. Corbin didn't have COVID.
no, it's not. Nope, I brought him to the doctor just in case, just ear infection.
Oh, well, I'm gonna be there
Yeah.
actually for real on Friday.
Okay.
Okay, so hopefully we can catch up then. Okay.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Okay. Thanks so
And-
much, Ashley.
Okay, I'll talk to you later.
Oh wait, you have
Bye,
another
Grant.
question?
No, if you have to, I can hold off till Friday.
Oh no, you can talk.
That's
It cut you off, like you kind of froze, and I thought you were.
Oh,
done. I'm
okay.
sorry. No. I have time. But
Okay.
I'm
Okay,
sorry.
okay. So then that's okay. My next question from that is, so if it is a project, if I was to do the IRB project, if the participants are new hires, and let's say I'm measuring the results, like their training results, plus measuring progress of the students they're with, do I also need to get consent or assent forms for the students, even if, since I'm measuring them, but they're not the target
Yeah.
participants?
So they typically not, because the intervention won't be on the children. Like you're not.
But it could
directly-
affect their training in the fact that they may go an extra week without their therapist receiving additional training if they're in baseline.
Yeah.
So if
You-
it
you
affects
might-
them that way.
If that's the case, then you're doing something differently with them because of the intervention somebody else is getting. So in that case, the way I'd handle it is you draft a letter to the parents just saying, your child is in this classroom, and in this classroom we have new hires. We will be testing out a few procedures with the new hires, and that may have some impact in short term on how often they will see that person.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, that'll work. Let me see. Another one, I'm sorry, I have a few questions for you.
Oh, sure. I'm glad.
Okay. Dr. Cohen says for her research summary, she wants us to add to the next one problem. Do you not want that?
Add to the what? You cut out.
Add each one, like add research summary 2 to the first. So by the end, it's going to
Yes.
be, let's say 10 of them in
Yes.
one.
Yes, do that. Just get in the habit of doing that. Yeah.
But have mine separate for your class from hers.
What you can do is you can list them all, and you could just, some people just put on the side K or G, like who they use them
Perfect.
for. Yeah.
Okay.
And trust me, it's gonna be good when you're done. It's gonna be really good. Okay, like you did it that way. Okay.
Yeah. My folders are kind of a mess just from the teacher 1 rank of all the research summaries that were started, then completed, and all that. The syllabus where it lays out all the meetings that we have for the class, some of them say Adobe instead of Zoom. Is that going to be a separate link?
No.
Okay, same thing with that.
That is
Okay.
At the beginning of the semester, they basically said Zoom, if Zoom doesn't work, you need a backup plan for it. But Zoom is in good shape. Like last semester, we had to teeter around a little bit, but this semester, I think we're in good shape. If there's any change, you would be notified.
Okay, I can hear you. I see you now.
Yeah. Okay.
You were cutting out on me there for
Sorry.
a second.
I just said if there would be any change, you would
and I
be
think
notified.
Perfect. And I think one last thing, so Derek was saying that you and he spoke of me not needing to do the BDS modules.
That's right.
So is there something else that I need to do in replacement? I don't want it to seem like I'm trying to just get out of an assignment.
Yeah.
So
well,
is there,
I know-
is there anything that I should do in place of that?
I know that you're not just getting out of assignments. That's number one. Okay. Number 2, I think we are trying to come up with something, but we don't want to just give you something that's going to be busy work. We want something that's going to be beneficial for you.
Yeah.
Um,
And so
but
if I
we are
think of
working on that.
something something? You want me to
And you're
run
not
it
going to
by
have
you
to
if
go
something?
back to square one, where it's about moving forward. Okay.
Good. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Because if you could see even just the note taking, even just like this alone, if you can see it, was my way of keeping up with which modules I
Yeah.
was doing when.
Totally.
Because I was trying to rotate between the 4 modules as they
Mhm.
recommend. But okay, let me see. That might be it. Let me check. I've got a kind of notes all over my notebook and my document on the computer.
Hey, I have notebooks,
I
documents,
think that's actually it.
pieces of paper everywhere, so I get it. All right. Well, if you think of something between now and
Yeah.
Ashley, if you think of something between now and Friday, just let me know. The more we can try to address things before Friday, it's going to be better for Friday. So, reach out. You
Okay.
can text me or call or Zoom. My whole week is spent kind of just doing all of this.
Well, and I guess so. My goal would my question would be, what would the goal be of BDS modules for Nichols? Is it to be able to pass the BACB exam, or
Both.
so
It
that
is
might help
both.
me understand.
It's supposed to serve as a learning tool in the courses, and it's supposed to serve as a study tool for the test.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll be thinking, or I'll be keeping my mind open, thinking of any possibilities. I haven't thought of anything yet, though.
All right, no problem. Well, I'll see you soon. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.